It's one of the hinge moments of the war, an Axis defeat that turns the course of history. It's not Stalingrad, it's the Tunisia campaign. In this episode of the History Book Buffs, we're reading Saul David's Tunisgrad, in which he argues that Tunisia campaign is one of the most overlooked and most crucial moments of the entire war. Does he convince us? Well, stay tuned to find out. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Every time we talk about a great history book and also throw in a few extras on the same topic, fact and fiction. And right now, I'll hand you over to me, Antonia Senior, talking to top historian Roger Moorhouse about Tunisgrad on the History Book Buffs. So, Roger, welcome back. We've both been away for a long summer.
Yeah, been gallivanting, both of us. Back with a vengeance in the autumn.
You've been doing history stuff, though, haven't you? You've been all around.
Well, so have you.
Well, kind of. Oh, yeah. Well, I did. I walked over the Alps in the shadow of Napoleon.
You did.
And you drove around Eastern Europe in a camper van.
Yes.
So
seeing historical sites.
Yeah. So we both took kind of busman's holiday from History Book Buffs. But anyway, we're delighted to be back, and we're back with a banger. We thought we would start with something with like lots of blood and guts and gore.
And sand.
Yeah. So we're in North Africa with Saul David and his new book, Tunisgrad. So he's talking about the Tunisian campaign, and he sets out with this quite girthy book, I would say. Girthy?
Okay.
Shut up. You're such a child. Anyway, he sets off with this big book to look at the Tunisian campaign, and he starts from the premise that this is Dog's had enough. That this is a forgotten but utterly crucial moment in World War II military history.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to talk a little bit at the end about whether we think he's made that case or not.
Mm-hmm.
But let's, get into it. So should we start in July 1942? I think that's the crucial place to start.
Well, yes, I think we can probably wind back a bit to, the beginning of the North African campaign itself.
Okay.
Just to go back to the, Italian invasion of essentially British Egypt, which is in late 1940.
Okay.
And
we could go even further back. Why are the Italians there? Because of Mussolini's
Mussolini's
imperial
empire. His imperial pretensions. And of course, the Italian empire in Libya goes back to, I think, 1911. So it predates Mussolini as well. It's Mussolini's, ambitions to be a sort of, a fascist empire builder. He comes in late in the French campaign, of course, in 1940.
Yeah.
He initially told Hitler that he wasn't ready to join in the Polish campaign in 1939. He then joined the French campaign right at the end. I think literally the last week that France was basically sort of negotiating terms. Then Mussolini invades, hoping to sort of have a share of the garlands, but not necessarily of the blood. And then he has this sort of catastrophe in the Balkans, invading Greece. Greece bolstered by the British. And at the same time as that, he's invading Egypt, where the British are as well. So he's sort of flexing his muscles in the autumn of 1940, and it doesn't go terribly well. So Italy is quite a strong force, particularly in naval sense. It's got lots of sort of, it's got lots of surface ships, got lots of submarines. It's got lots of men and lots of material, but there's not much in the way of sort of the martial dash that you see in the case of the Germans, for example, with few exceptions. I mean, there are some elite units that are pretty good, but most don't really have the sort of the fighting capability and the leadership that the Germans have. So they are a little bit the poor relation militarily. So they have to be bolstered. They soon get a bloody nose when both in Balkans and in North Africa, and soon have to be sort of bailed out by Big Brother, Nazi Germany. Hitler has this sort of residual sense of loyalty, I think, to Mussolini as the senior fascist in a way, which is played out not only in propping his forces up in the Balkans in 1940 and also in North Africa in 1940, which is why Rommel and the Afrika Korps, go to North Africa in the first place, is to back the Italians up. But also later on, after Mussolini falls in the autumn of 43, and then later on, in saving Mussolini personally, he's rescued by German airborne troops and sort of whisked away from, possible imprisonment and or maybe even execution by the post-fascist Italian regime. So, it's a weird relationship actually between the two of them. And if there's one leader that Hitler was routinely kind of loyal to, and to some extent deferential to, it was Mussolini all the way through. Weirdly. So in a sense, that's what drags the Africa Corps to North Africa in the first place, was propping up the Italians. You then got, the British pushed the Italians all the way back. The Africa Corps comes in with Rommel, brilliant general, all of that we know. And he pushes the British all the way back. And then you've got the two battles of El Alamein, which are crucial. One of which, halts Rommel's advance. The next one, begins the pushback. And then where this all fits together with the battle for Tunisia, or the campaign for Tunisia, is that the Allied decision in that summer of 42 is to try and effectively sort of cut off Rommel's rear by attacking in Tunisia and Algeria, because he's being pushed back across essentially Libya.
But it's a bigger decision than that, right?
It is a much bigger. That's the micro.
Yeah,
exactly.
In order to commit those troops, they have to make a broader decision about the course of the war.
Yeah.
Right. So the summer of 1942, what options are open to them? Where are we? You're, Churchill moving the little men across the giant board. What are your options, and why are you choosing this one?
Stalin is absolutely insistent that there should be a second front. So
the second front in Europe.
Yeah. So he's been, carrying the weight of the conflict against the Germans since the previous summer, since Operation Barbarossa in June 41. Obviously, before that, he spent 22 months essentially as Hitler's ally. So there's, we have to throw that in there. There might well be. So we can take Stalin's complaints with a pinch of salt, but still, in terms of inter-Allied relations in 1942, this was a serious thing.
Sure. So Stalin wants an invasion directly into Europe, right? So at this stage, the main strategic thinking is for the potential to just invade through continental Europe, through France.
Yeah.
And this is what they're weighing up.
Yeah.
And Churchill's in talks with the Americans. He's in talks with Stalin. What's Churchill's?
Churchill likes a soft underbelly.
Does he?
Yeah.
Don't we all? I like a soft underbelly. Sorry,
have we strayed again? No, he likes a softer. He's all about his strategic thinking. Even if you go back to the First World War, the Dardanelles campaign, which was his baby, is essentially a soft underbelly operation, right?
Yes.
This is that you don't go for the sort of fortified, the main front line. You go round the back and try and hit them in the guts.
Right, and their main objection to crossing the Channel effectively at this point is just how bloody it will be, how likely it is to be repulsed, how desperately difficult it will be.
And that was shown, you've got the Dieppe raid, of course, mainly done by Canadians in 42, and that was bloody. So if they needed proof that was what would happen with a cross-channel invasion in 42, there it was.
And the Americans and relatively new allies, the American armed forces haven't fought anything for a long time, but there are still quite a lot of American generals on Roosevelt's side, aren't there, who are still quite into the idea of just going for it.
Yeah, they're quite, like Americans tend to be. There's a lot of them are quite gung-ho. But crucially, I think for Churchill, he needed to have a sort of joint operation. He wanted a joint operation with the Americans to, I suppose, cement that relationship, both sort of militarily and politically. So he needed something. He needed to square the circle, that they needed to have an operation together. And he's always pushing for these soft underbellies. So, logically, he's got to satisfy Stalin. He's got to do something, because Stalin's basically saying, where's your blood cost? What are you doing for the, to win the war? So he's got to do something. So the decision is made to go with North Africa. Yeah.
So he has a conference with the Americans, doesn't he, where Roosevelt backs him against the advice of some of his generals.
Yeah.
To go for North Africa, and then Churchill has to go to the Soviet Union and sell it to Stalin, which doesn't go so well. I really like Saul's description of this in the book. And he says that, you know, Churchill's in there trying to sell this idea to Stalin. And there's a brilliant bit where, so I think sometimes in the West, we kind of underestimate Stalin, maybe because, you know, we kind of think of him as a sort of mad thug who kills everybody, but he's a much more complicated, much more interesting person than that. And Saul's account of the meeting between Churchill and Stalin, at which this North African campaign is kind of, you know, rubber stamped effectively, is that Stalin's unbelievably quick to get to the detail and unbelievably quick to understand the tactical ramifications of choosing North Africa over everywhere else. So it's going to, you know, it's the soft underbelly argument, as you said, and it's also going to like Stalin points out, it will deter Spain from entering the war. It will, you know, potentially leave Italy open once they've got North Africa. So Stalin can immediately see all the advantages. He still wants a second front.
Yeah.
But what's instructive, I think, about that meeting is how sharp he is, and how much he takes Churchill by surprise as well. Because I think, you know, Churchill's anti-Russian and anti-Soviet and anti-Bolshevik sentiment is a strong force. But actually, these are those moments where he has contact with Stalin. He's like, Jesus, this guy is formidable.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
So interesting.
Interesting, indeed.
So they decide to go for it.
So they do. And that's a campaign that then lasts through. So the landings are in November 1942, torch landings. There's the race for Tunis, which is a number of engagements there as the sort of allies and the Germans race to take Tunis. The Germans win that race. They take Tunis, take most of the sort of high ground, and they in a way similar to sort of the First World War, where after that initial push on Paris, they then withdraw to high ground, and then that's what the Allies then have to sort of storm for the next 4 years, effectively. They kind of do the same job, so they have a lot of the high ground and so on. So it makes the Allies' job that much more difficult. And that conflict, that campaign, basically lasts until May of the following year. So it's pretty much a 6-month conflict. Lots of set pieces. I mean, not least, you know, Kasserine Pass later on, the Battle of the Mareth Line. So some interesting engagements. Some of them very touch and go. The Germans had, you know, there's Germans and the Italians, of course. That there's a sort of an interesting role played by the Vichy French. So that was a question as to whether the Vichy French would actually fight, because they were nominally neutral.
Yeah, but it was complicated for the French, obviously, because there's French imperialism
it's French territory, effectively.
So there were complicated things at stake, and at one point, quite early in the kind of planning, there's a French general whose name I completely forget, who's brought in by Eisenhower and offered a kind of role as a sort of as the figurehead to draw in the Vichy French. And he sort of expects to be in charge of the whole operation. And Eisenhower's like, well, no, I'm in charge of the whole. What are you talking about?
Very French, that, isn't it?
Yeah. And, you know, and so for the French, it's all wrapped up in like sort of questions of, you know, identity and shame and, you know, how do they cling on to this idea that they are one of the imperial big boys when actually they're half a country under the
jackboot.
Yeah. It's really interesting stuff, that.
Yeah, it is. And that sort of collapse of the Vichy forces, because they basically kind of roll over. You know, the question of whether they would stand and fight for the Germans is answered pretty swiftly. And they kind of don't. And that leads ultimately to, you know, Hitler's occupation of all of France, because they had left half of France unoccupied up until that point. And then you've got the sinking of the scuttling of the French fleet at Toulon, for example. All of that is in that autumn of 1942. So it has really profound ramifications in the immediate term, in terms of you know, power politics. I wouldn't say great power politics, because I didn't really put Vichy in the great power, but in terms of power politics, it has immediate ramifications. And then of course there's much more serious great power ramifications later on. So the initial, you know, essentially the British and the Americans against the British, allied, some New Zealanders and Indians as well, Gurkhas and so on as well.
And it's the first
against the Germans and the Italians, and the Italians also proved to be the weak link in there as well for the Germans.
It's the first time, isn't it, that the British and the Americans have fought side by side in any theatre
in this war,
and
that's a bit scratchy. That's a bit scratchy.
It starts scratchy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that Saul does very well is there's a kind of cast of generals involved in all of this. There's obviously Eisenhower. There's a British general called General Alexander, who's effectively the kind of liaison man between the Americans and the British, and he comes out of it all very well, because it's not always an easy thing to do, because these are two armies with different cultures, with different sorts of senses of who they are. And of course the British have been fighting effectively on their own. This would be their argument for years, and here are the Americans with the nice
Johnny come lately,
with their clean uniforms and their white teeth. I mean, you could see why they'd be a bit
gung-ho attitude,
and their money,
and the money. You can see that in sort of Monty's attitude. Monty's sort of famously quite haughty and quite arrogant and so on, and he does treat the Americans with a degree of contempt. I wouldn't say entirely without justification, but that's partly who he was, I think.
But it is quite interesting. So watching through Saul's book, how the different generals deal with these kind of issues, and how they, the ones who kind of are conciliatory, the ones who are arrogant. It's a fun cast of characters to play with, and he clearly enjoys that. He does do it well.
I mean, that sort of juxtaposition of Eisenhower and Monty is quite fun, and he does play with that quite well. So he tells that very well, I think. I mean, in the end, obviously, it's a protracted campaign. We won't go into the military minutiae.
Let Saul do that.
Let's all do that. Yeah. Ends May 43, and essentially, with an Allied victory, of course.
But an Allied victory on extraordinary good terms for the Allies, right? So Saul's got the figures. I think 70,000
casualties.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And then, but they've against 250,000.
Yeah. Huge. Mostly captured, actually, because that's the benefit, I think, of, I suppose, from the German and particularly the Italian perspective of fighting against the Western Allies, was that they kind of knew that if they surrendered, they'd be okay. Which certainly Italians wouldn't have felt surrendering to the Soviets. There were Italians fighting on the Eastern Front, for example.
Oh yeah, you're not going to.
And you're not going to, if you're lucky, you're going to have to survive 5 years in a salt mine, right? And the same thing for Germans surrendering to the
although there's some quite nice moments of German racial nonsense, isn't there, when they're surrendering?
They only want to surrender to white soldiers.
Yeah, they're like, please, we're not surrendering to the North African fellas and the.
I know. I thought that was. I mean, I don't know why I found that quite shocking, but I did. I mean, it's not a great surprise. But
to Nazis in racist shocker. But it's actually reading it.
Exactly, but reading it saying, "Oh, we're only surrendering to white soldiers." And I thought, crikey, but absolutely, Nazis in racist shocker.
Because as you said, there's been like North African troops themselves fighting. There's Indian troops there. There's a kind of quite.
And I think it was it Brian Horrocks was on the British side who said, "You'll surrender to whoever's there," and he makes sure they were Gurkhas, just to rub it in. Brilliant. But that was part of the thing, was that particularly for the Italians, they knew as soon as it was game over, it's game over, and they just surrendered. So the numbers taken prisoner are disproportionately large compared, for example, with somewhere like Stalingrad. Understandably.
Presumably that then creates a bit of a sort of logistical headache for the Allies.
Of course. Yeah, and then of course they all have to be, shipped off to wherever they have to be shipped off to. But this all was a sort of a stick in the eye for Hitler, who of course wanted everyone always to fight to the last man and the last bullet and all the rest of it. And that's pretty much his sort of intransigence all the time, not only on a tactical level, but also in the minutiae. Nobody was allowed to, it's almost like Stalin with his no step back. Hitler was not allowing Rommel, for example, to effect any sort of tactical withdrawal, just saying stand and fight. And well, what can you do? They're being outfought and outgunned. And it's, as much as anything, given the distances involved, it becomes a logistical battle.
Yeah.
It's about supplies. So all of that, I mean, he tells it very well, and it's a really interesting stuff. But what I think is much more significant, and this is much more significant in his argument as well, is the wider sort of grand strategic stuff.
Yeah. So, okay, we'll go through them, but firstly, it's a big defeat for Hitler, right?
Yeah.
I mean, simple,
Yeah.
but it comes. There's a kind of triptych of big defeats for Hitler, aren't there? And Hitler is used to winning, right?
Yes.
So it's 43, but up to that point, largely, he's won, right?
Yeah.
And then there are three. We've got Stalingrad.
Yeah.
We've got Tunisia, and there's a third one.
Well, there's Guadalcanal in the Pacific, which is technically not Hitler.
Yeah, all right, fair play.
No.
But what I mean, it's an Axis defeat.
Yes, an Axis defeat.
And they're not used to them.
Yeah.
They haven't had many big defeats.
Yeah.
So one of the bits I really enjoyed reading about in Tunisgrad was, Hitler and Goebbels sort of, had the messaging around it. How do we message?
How do you sort of?
Because we're not used to this. And that was really interesting because defeat doesn't fit fate, right?
Yeah.
Hitler, like all ideologues, believes in a kind of determinism. He believes in a kind of things will fall out for the Reich because the Reich is, ideologically sound and it's the future and, I'm recreating a new world. So it's not. So the messaging of a defeat is even more complicated than it is for a kind of non-ideological state, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is something I've said for a while, is that it all backs up this idea that 43. So you've got, this is May 43, and then at pretty much the same time, you've got the Battle of the Atlantic, which obviously I've been writing about, is essentially lost, is essentially conceded by Dönitz in May 43. You've then got the Battle of Kursk is August, which is crucial, victory for the Soviets on the Eastern Front. You've got the kick on from the Tunisian campaign, obviously, is the collapse of Mussolini's Italy, which happens in sort of August, September. So Mussolini falls out of the war, the Italians fall out of the war. You've then, at the same time, July, I think it is, you've got the bombing of Hamburg, which is like the bombing of Hamburg, which is absolutely catastrophic. Admittedly, the British kind of can't repeat the trick, but in terms of propaganda value, this is huge. So you can see in every theatre through that summer of 43, Germany's basically being hammered. And the point that they should have reached, logically, which is the point that they reached at the end of the First World War, is to say to themselves, okay, so we now can't win. We haven't yet lost, but we technically cannot win.
So right? What do we do?
So what do we do? But of course, as you said, like as you alluded to, with the ideological blinkers on, those decisions can't really sensibly be made. They can't ask themselves that question. So that's why the war basically lasts for another 2 years.
Well, Saul points out to us at this point that one of Hitler's advisors starts making noises about trying to make a peace with Stalin.
With the Soviets, yeah.
I think it's really, really fascinating, that turning point in 43. And I know because so recent sort of historical thinking holds that the economics of how World War II stacked up meant that the Nazis were always going to lose, right? Particularly when the Americans came in. But it always strikes me that, although I'm sure that's right. That's a very sort of hindsight-driven argument, and it's so interesting to think if you're on the ground and you're living it, right? That's not so obvious to you. None of that is obvious to you, and yet it does come a point where the war is unwinnable, and the kind of the inevitability that historians always, it's the A level set question, isn't it? Was it inevitable X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
But there does become a point in that summer, doesn't there, where this is it? The the end is kind of inevitable. It's just how it's going to play
exactly. And weirdly, so like Germany only sort of kicks into a proper sort of wartime economy in 43.
out.
So it's been trying to maintain a sort of a hybrid economy up to that point.
Mm.
So in a sense, they obviously realised that this is it, we're up against it. But I think you're right that the writing's on the wall, and they are. And I would reiterate that point. They are at the point that the German generals and the Kaiser was at the end of the First World War, where they should have known that they could no longer win. And so, like you said, there are some voices that are saying this.
Yeah.
They could no longer win, and now is the time. If we're going to salvage anything, we need to make terms. But they couldn't.
No, and ideologically it's impossible, but it's also impossible for anybody to convince Hitler.
Yeah.
But what makes it all so unbearably tragic is now, disclaimer, I have also just read your brilliant book, which is coming out soon, about the U-boat war. And we're going completely on a rabbit hole from Saul's book. I apologize for a minute, but the people being recruited by the Germans in 44 and into 45 to fight this ideological war were basically children, right? So the net effects of this ideologically blinkered refusal to accept what was obvious meant that there were 18-year-old boys being put to sea in U-boats that could barely float with no training, in the knowledge that they were all going to die. And it seems to me to be
and the same on land, to be fair, because you've got that. I mean, you've got that sort of the ramping up of casualty figures, and it's ever younger sort of cadres of recruits.
Right. And I mean, obviously, look, the kind of, we all have moral outrage towards Nazi Germany, and I'm not for a second saying that we don't, but within that sort of blanket horror for that regime, I think it's also reasonable to think, a lot of these boys, even if they are committed Nazis, they're still children who've been raised and brainwashed horribly. And I just, I think the idea, it's bad enough sending these kids into a war that you think you might win, but sending them into a war that you've lost, but you're just fighting to the last bullet, for your own sort of ideological sop. I find it, again, I mean, Hitler was a bad man, shocker. I mean, it's like no surprise that he behaved terribly, but I find that really
still surprises you.
I just find it so depressing. Anyway, sorry, we need to get back. So yes, it's a terrible moment, but I think we need to unpick a bit more specifically militarily what North Africa means for the subsequent campaign in Italy.
Yeah, well, it's the key to Italy, isn't it? So as soon as the campaign from an Axis perspective is lost in North Africa, then it leaves Italy wide open, and the Germans know straight away that they were well aware of Italy's sort of general fighting capabilities, with caveats. I mean, there were some forces, as I said, that were half decent, but the average Italian soldier was not as good as the average German soldier.
So it's the springboard. They go into North Africa, from North Africa to Italy, and obviously Italy is the beginning of the end of continental Europe as a Nazi empire.
And then collapses in September. So Italy collapses in September.
Yeah. And the other thing that
So in that sense, what as you said, what Stalin foresaw absolutely happens.
Yeah.
This is the beginning of the end, effectively.
The other thing that Saul points to, I thought convincingly, was the kind of moral effect of having a joint Anglo-US operation that worked. And because I think we take the special relationship for granted because of hindsight, right? But, this was new stuff. This was like groundbreaking.
Yeah. And the Americans had come in, admittedly late in the First World War, and had fought on the Western Front, so on. But again, it was very late in the day.
Yeah.
So I think it is fair to say that this was in terms of propaganda and in terms of cementing a relationship, like you say, a special relationship. Absolutely, I think it's crucial.
Yeah. So this, which all of which brings us to the crucial question. So Saul sets out his story. He says that this is a hinge moment in World War II, that the Tunisian campaign was absolutely crucial, and that it's been overlooked. So we probably definitely agree it's been overlooked, right?
Yeah.
As he points out, there's been no real, there's been books on elements of the North African campaign and lots written about El Alamein.
Yeah.
But this, not so much.
Yeah. And I think that's partly, I think there's partly a sort of a myopia about North Africa. I think we do tend to put it into the category of a sort of a sideshow.
Right.
And I think one of the crucial arguments of this is to elevate it, that campaign, from being a sideshow to actually being strategically vital.
Yeah.
And he makes that case, I think, very well. And interestingly, it's juxtaposed because of the timing. The winter of 42 into 43 is the winter of Stalingrad, of course, on the Eastern Front, and that coincides broadly with the Battle of Guadalcanal, which is seen as the turning point in the Pacific War, Antonia. And of course, you've got the Tunisian campaign happening broadly at the same time. So it's kind of a given that people talk about Stalingrad and Guadalcanal being the hinge moment in the war, in those two theatres. And what I think Saul's doing very well is to say, okay, well, you've got those two, we can add Tunisia in that as well.
Yeah.
They're happening at the same time and is just as strategically significant as the other two. And I think he makes the case quite well.
I think he makes the case really well. I was completely convinced, to be honest.
And what's interesting is that contemporary voices, German and other and allied, are making exactly that point at the time.
Yes.
So this isn't a sort of post facto hindsight, blah, blah, blah. This is actually said at the time by very senior voices.
Yeah, this is crucial.
Yeah.
This is the hinge moment.
Yeah.
This is it. The Germans know it. The British know it.
Yeah.
And I suppose for Churchill, it's vindication for his underbelly strategy, which I suppose in one way, I mean, that the underbelly strategy with hindsight ends up looking like a sideshow by definition, because it is slightly
it's
stage left.
It is, deliberately so.
Yeah. But we've kind of forgotten.
We've forgotten the ulterior motive.
Yeah.
Which is to get to the heart, and that's what it was about.
To get to the heart, and also and so the alternative plan to just throw troops at continental Europe,
Fortress Europe.
Yeah, and so the point is made by people who are contemporaries, making the point for this being a brilliant hinge moment, is that it would have been much easier, because obviously Operation Overlord happens a year later, so there is the invasion of Europe, but it happens after the collapse of Italy. It happens at a point where the Germans can't just concentrate all their troops in one place, which they would have been able to do had they gone in 43, 42. And all of that strikes me as being quite convincing as well. That it would have been. Yeah,
and as well, I mean, by the time you get to Overlord in the summer of 44, of course, the German forces have already had their guts torn out on the Eastern Front to a large extent. Operation Bagration and so on is going on through that summer as well. So that is a massive drain on Germany's sort of martial ability and potential. So it's another year on.
And they've lost their main ally in the continent. They're depleted. Of
course. And I think, arguably, I think Churchill was probably right. If you'd tried an overlord in the summer of 43, it probably would have been a catastrophe for all those reasons. So, it was, as it turns out, I think it was the right decision.
Yeah. Well done, Churchill.
Well done, Churchill. And well done, Saul David.
Yes, really great book.
Really good book.
Really enjoyed it. So we've been, as is our wont, we've been looking for other books about the North African campaign or Tunisia.
Yes.
How have you got on? What have you got to recommend?
One that struck me, because it was cited in Saul's book and reminded me of when I read it, was Hans von Lutsk, who was one of the German, I get it right, I always get these things wrong, divisional commander, I think, in the Afrika Korps. And he wrote a brilliant survived the war, obviously, wrote a brilliant memoir called Panzer Commander. And, he was, very prominent in all. It's his memoir of the war generally, but a lot of it is based in North Africa. So really nicely written, and it's a nice insight from the other side. So Hans von Lutz, Panzer Commander, I'll give you that one.
Okay. Bird's eye view. You like one of them? As we've
I
mentioned, a
do.
Robert Ball
Alan Moorhead is the is one of these.
Alan Moorhead. So I didn't know about this. I love Alan Moorhead because I've read other like stuff of his, and I didn't. Saul says that he's written this sort of eyewitness trilogy. He was a journalist embedded in North Africa.
Yeah.
That's on
the Desert War.
On my Christmas reading list.
Yeah. So I do, as you know, I do love an eyewitness account, and that's it's sort of to largely sort of a compilation of eyewitness accounts.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm all in for that one.
They're always great. I mean, they give so much. I prefer them to be sort of contextualized and so on, rather than just kind of regurgitated as some later ones have been. But that's a good one.
Yeah, brilliant.
What about you? Fiction?
So I struggled a little bit with fiction until I had the recollection that The English Patient was set in the North African campaign. Now, The English Patient, lots of people have seen the film, but the book is amazing. I highly recommend reading it if you haven't read it. Have you read it?
I saw the film.
Okay. Read the book. You Philistine. But then apart from that, there wasn't. I mean, I have read so many novels set during World War II, right? So many. And I kind of, I was trying Dr. Google, and I was sort of looking at my bookshelf, and I was coming up a kind of blank. And then my first thought was, wow, this is fertile territory. People go out there and write books about North Africa. And then I thought,
but there's a problem.
I thought about the sort of deadening effect of the current kind of boring cultural wars on publishing.
Yeah.
In the sense that if you wanted to set out and write a multi-layered book about World War II with lots of voices of ordinary people and soldiers, that kind of gave you a kind of multi-layered effect.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do North Africa nowadays. You'd be insane because
unless you're a Tunisian.
Unless you're Tunisian.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to read if I've missed brilliant, books by Tunisian writers on the Tunisian campaign, please let me know. I didn't see any. But the point is, this insistence that you have to be kind of culturally identified with the people that you write about is such a dead weight. It just deadens things. Because, you can't find someone who represents all of the cross-section of the people that you want to write about. And, it used to be the case that you could just do your research, try as hard as you could to make these voices sound authentic, because your whole point as an author is to be a ventriloquist for other people's experiences, right? And you're never going to get it right. But in the search,
and everyone, crucially, everyone brings their biases with them. That's the nature of the beast. But your job is also to try and minimize that.
Well, I mean, we talk about this all the time.
Yeah.
That we come from a kind of tradition where you recognize bias, but you try and get rid of it as far as you can, in the knowledge that you'll never be entirely successful, but you can give it a good go.
Yeah.
But we're living in a time where, the bias is identified, embedded, celebrated, and a reason for activism.
Yeah.
And we're dinosaurs, dude. But I think it feels to me sad that you'd have to be very brave to write The English Patient nowadays. You would have to be basically suicidal to write if you're not North African yourself to write a book set in North Africa
kind of,
in the World War II.
It's very stifling, and as I say, it feels like a backward step, but there you go.
Yeah, dinosaurs. We'll just go and rewatch The English Patient and Ice Cold and Alex.
Yeah, exactly.
And just
and I'm just watching that meteorite going.
Come friendly bombs.
Yes, exactly.
We're born in the wrong time, but at least we weren't born in 1943.
That's very true. Yeah.
Anyway, there we are. We're ranting now. It's golf club rants about publishing.
But bottom line.
Yeah, well done, Saul David.
Great book.
Top book. Go out, buy it.
Absolutely right.
Brilliant. See you next time.
Next time.